Welcome back to Baron's New Vegas Gun Guides. This time we'll be finishing up the Cowboy Revolver series, at least the traditional ones, with the Hunting Revolver. Now, the 4570 Government is personally one of Baron's favorite calibers. It remains largely unchanged since 1873. Originally, the 4570-405 round stood for the 45 caliber of the bore, the 70 grains of black powder it took, and with a 405 grain bullet. It replaced the 50-70 caliber that the U.S. military had been using and found itself to be very popular in the U.S. military and the civilian markets. The 45-70 was used in great effect in medium-range flat shots. A place where it also excelled in a style of shooting that's kind of gone out of style is a longer-range, higher elevation shooting, much like you shoot a mortar. Now, this could propel the shots out to even a range of 1,600 yards, compared to its about 150-yard shots of flat trajectory, which is used mainly today. The main change through the ages is the lower weight of the gunpowder over the black powder, and it still remains kind of an unpopular round for revolvers. The gun used for New Vegas' inspiration was the Magnum Research BFR, which is quite the handgun. Now, going back to the bullet, what hasn't changed is the weight of that bullet. At around 60% heavier than a usual 44 Magnum load, this revolver does just over 60% more damage, which is quite appropriate, at a whopping 58 damage. With a bigger bullet and a bigger gun, you get a bigger lag in shooting time, however, which is only at about 1.5 shots per second. This brings us to a DPS of 87, with it dropping to 45.8 DPS with the reloads. Now, this is also important to remember that it only has a 5-shot cylinder versus the 6-shot cylinders of the other two revolvers. Now, with that being said, the smaller cylinder, because of the bigger bullet, doesn't really lend this weapon to close-range fighting, and that is extra true as it comes equipped with the default 2.46 times scope, almost as much as the Trail Carbine's modded scope. But when you need it, it's probably best to use VATS in close range. At 31 AP per shot, it is expensive, but with an efficiency of 1.9 AP per damage, it's fairly fair if you can afford it. You learn that long to medium range is the happy place for this weapon, or at least shooting big targets. With a spread of .35, the best of any cowboy weapon so far, this combined with its base reload time of 3 seconds, it can be dangerous when enemies have the chance to get the drop on you. Now, for crit shots, it's nothing special. At a times 1% multiplier, it's a normal chance to strike. But the increased amount of damage it gets and the long-range capabilities of the weapon make it a great stealth alpha strike weapon, especially against larger targets or hardier ones. However, from here the downsides really start to show. The bigger caliber rounds wreak havoc on the gun, only lasting 545 reloads before breaking, half of the 357. Of course, this is with standard rounds. It also weighs 4 pounds, which, while not terrible, is still pretty heavy. And for mods, outside of the gunrunner's arsenal, there are none. But there are 2 strange mods that come with the GRA, which is the match barrel at 1400 caps, which reduce the spread to .2, a massive increase, and the 6-shot cylinder at 1100 caps, which, as the name implies, it increases the capacity to 6, but unfortunately it doesn't affect the reload animation, so you'll see 5. Now, the cost is going to be a surprise. At only 3,500 caps, or 6,000 caps with GRA mod, this makes it cheaper than the Trail Carbine and cheaper than a 44 Magnum with the mods, and that's for the vanilla hunting revolver. Now, those savings will come in handy though, as the 4570 Government round is not cheap. The standard round is 4 caps each, with its hollow point variant at 8 caps per round, with the usual 1.75 times damage, but with the AP times 3. And with the handloader perk, you get access to the dubiously helpful semi-wad cutter, which, valued at 5 caps per round, and with the following effects: 1.2 times damage, AP minus 6, but an increased durability loss of 3 times, meaning only 179 shots from peak condition for a standard hunting revolver. Now, there is some good news. The almost unique variant, the Ranger Sequoia, is leagues better. It is stronger at 62 damage per shot, with a faster rate of fire of 1.69 shots per second, This creates a DPS of 104.6 with a modified reload DPS of 52. It also is more accurate at a spread of 0.1, but it's a little bit of a dubious help because it actually lacks the scope that the hunting revolver does. But it does have a crit multiplier of 1.5, making it more likely to score those wonderful crits. And finally, a cherry on top, its durability is increased to 745 standard shots and 245 semi-wad cutter rounds. Now, the most important changes that this semi-unique variant brings is its wonderful interior makeover. Black steel, dark walnut grip, and gold filigree twining all the way around the gun, with the words, "For honorable service against all tyrants," on either side of the barrel of the gun, and with a stamp on the bottom that says 20 years. Assumingly, this is for 20 years of service and not because they reached 20 years of age. It also, as is previously stated before, has a complete lack of scope, revealing that the hunting revolver's sights are actually these thin posts, very similar to a .44 Magnum. And all this at a value of only 1,200 caps, which almost kind of seems like a typo, because that's only 1.5 cowboy repeaters. But it's not really like this is a gun you're ever gonna sell. Now, both versions take 75 guns and 6 strength to use properly, making it a dedicated gunslinger's gun. You'll be hard-pressed to use it unless you really spec into guns. Sadly, both guns are too big to sneak into casinos and other holdout locations. The hunting revolver makes sense because it's got a big scope on it, and probably the Ranger Sequoia is a bit too ostentatious for those casinos. The normal variant can be found at Black Mountain, halfway up the mountain next to a gore bag. Another location is Bloodborne Cave. It can also be found in Freeside during the GI Blues quest on the Orissa, I believe that's how his name is pronounced, the guard that takes you through Freeside that's shamming everybody. He has one on his corpse, and if you play it the way that I do, then it's quite easy to get that hunting revolver. It can also be found at the RepCon test site hidden away, and from the quest Bleed Me Dry. It is also fun to find it at the Ranger Safe House if you're playing an NCR playthrough, but if you're playing an NCR playthrough, the Ranger Sequoia is probably your best bet. The Vendatron and the Great Khans will sell you hunting revolvers. And as I mentioned about the previous Ranger Sequoia, it can be found on Chief Hanlon at Camp Golf, and at Camp Golf, some of the Desert Ranger vets after level 16 will start carrying them. Now, with all that being said, we'll turn to, do you really need the 4570 hunting revolver? By the time you can get it in-game, it's fairly late, or at least mid-game, and while you might be able to get a weak one, unless you have jury-rigging, they're pretty hard to repair. And because they're so weak, it's kind of an offset of the high damage that they do. So unless you really reach for the Ranger Sequoia, you'll be hard-pressed to compete with the rest of the weapons that are going to be available at this point in the game. But that being said, much like all the other revolvers that I've reviewed so far, there's just something about it that feels so wonderful, and it really is hard to compete with something that's the driving aesthetic of Fallout New Vegas. Big, powerful, and Western.